Chapter 1. Introduction to Wealth and Legacy. This chapter introduces Evalyn Walsh McLean at the pinnacle of American high society in 1911, born into the unimaginable wealth of her father Thomas Walsh's Colorado gold mining fortune. We witness her transformation from a rough mining camp upbringing to becoming one of Washington, D.C.'s most powerful socialites through her marriage to Edward Ned McLean, heir to the Washington Post empire. The narrative centers on her fateful encounter with the Hope Diamond in Paris, where Pierre Cartier seduces her with tales of royal necks and mysterious deaths. Despite warnings about the curse, Evalyn's arrogance and belief in her invincibility lead her to purchase the legendary blue stone for $180,000. The chapter establishes the intoxicating world of Gilded Age excess while foreshadowing the tragedy to come, as Evalyn dismisses superstition and embraces what will become her family's doom. The tone balances opulent luxury with an underlying sense of foreboding. January 28, 1911, Saturday, Paris, France, Pierre Cartier's salon on Rue de la Paix. The winter light filtering through the tall windows of Pierre Cartier's salon cast everything in shades of pearl and shadow, but nothing could diminish the fire that blazed from the woman examining his most dangerous treasure. Evalyn Walsh McLean stood before the velvet-lined case, her gloved fingers hovering inches above the Hope Diamond, as if she could feel its legendary malevolence radiating through the glass like heat from a forge. At 24, Evalyn commanded attention simply by existing. Born into the dust and dreams of Colorado's mining camps, she had been transformed by her father's spectacular fortune into American royalty. Thomas Walsh, the Irish immigrant who struck the Camp Bird mine, had pulled enough gold from the earth to buy his daughter a place among kings. Now married to Ned McLean, whose family controlled the Washington Post and Cincinnati Enquirer, she possessed wealth so vast it seemed to bend reality around her desires. "Madame McLean," Pierre Cartier murmured, his accent thick as honey, "you are looking at 45 carats of history. This stone has rested against the throats of Marie Antoinette, adorned the turban of a sultan, and witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Some say it carries with it the accumulated weight of their fates." Evalyn laughed, the sound bright and careless in the hushed salon. "My dear Pierre, I don't collect jewelry for its ghosts. I collect it for its beauty, its rarity, its ability to make other women weep with envy." She leaned closer, studying the deep sapphire blue depths of the stone. "Though I admit, a scandalous reputation does add a certain frisson to ownership." Behind her, Ned shifted uncomfortably in his chair, already nursing his second brandy of the morning. The heir to newspaper fortunes was handsome in the dissolute way of wealthy young men, but alcohol had begun to blur the sharp edges of his charm. "Evie, darling, we already own enough rocks to pave Fifth Avenue. And this one comes with rather dire warnings, doesn't it, Monsieur Cartier?" The jeweler's smile never wavered. "Superstition is merely the tax that legend pays to history. Monsieur McLean, the diamond has indeed passed through many hands, and yes, some of its previous owners met unfortunate ends. King Louis V and his queen lost their heads to the guillotine. The Turkish sultan who owned it was deposed in a violent coup. Lord Francis Hope, from whom the stone takes its name, died bankrupt and broken. But correlation, as you Americans say, is not causation." Evalyn's eyes glittered with something that might have been avarice, or might have been destiny. She had grown up believing the world was a vast store, where everything was for sale, and her father owned the keys. The Camp Bird mine had yielded gold so pure and abundant that it transformed the Walsh family overnight from comfortable to incomprehensibly wealthy. By the time she was 18, Evalyn had developed appetites that could only be satisfied by the impossible, the legendary, the cursed. "Tell me about the curse," she said softly, never taking her gaze from the diamond. "I want to hear every delicious detail." Cartier obliged with the practiced ease of a man who understood that wealthy Americans bought stories as much as stones. He spoke of ancient Hindu temples and stolen idols, of mysterious deaths and financial ruin, of the inexorable fate that seemed to stalk anyone who dared claim the blue fire for their own. With each word, Evalyn felt herself drawn deeper into the stone's gravitational pull. The Hope Diamond lay in its case like a captured piece of midnight sky, its surface alive with an inner light that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Unlike the sharp, icy brilliance of white diamonds, this stone glowed with a phosphorescent menace that made Evalyn's pulse quicken. She had been told it was cursed, that it brought madness and death to all who possessed it. But as she stared into its depths, she felt only power. "I'll take it," she announced, her voice cutting through Cartier's elaborate mythology like a blade through silk. "But I want it reset. Something modern, platinum perhaps, with white diamonds to complement the blue. I intend to wear it, not hide it in a vault." Ned's glass clinked against the marble table as he set it down too hard. "Evie, for God's sake, think about what you're doing. The board is already questioning our expenditures, and a cursed diamond is hardly going to improve their confidence in our judgment." She turned to face him, and in that moment, the future crystallized between them, like ice forming on a window. "Ned, darling, your board questions everything because you've given them reason to doubt your competence. My purchases are made with my inheritance, not theirs. And I've never believed in limiting myself to safe, sensible choices." The transaction was completed with the efficiency that only vast wealth could command. Papers were signed, arrangements made for the resetting, insurance policies negotiated. As they prepared to leave, Cartier offered one final observation, his voice carefully neutral. "Madame McLean, if I may." The previous owners of this stone shared certain characteristics. They were all individuals of great power and greater pride, people who believed themselves exempt from the ordinary rules that govern lesser mortals. Evalyn paused at the threshold, her hand on the brass door handle. "And your point, Monsieur Cartier? Perhaps the curse is not in the stone itself, but in the kind of person who believes they can possess it without consequence." She smiled, radiant and terrible. "Then I suppose we shall discover whether I am different from my predecessors, or merely the latest in a long line of beautiful fools." Outside, Paris sparkled in the winter sunlight, oblivious to the transaction that had just sealed the fate of one of America's most prominent families. As their carriage rolled through the cobblestone streets toward their hotel, Evalyn felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like an ermine cape. She had purchased more than a diamond, she had bought herself a legend. What she did not yet understand was that some legends were written in blood, and the Hope Diamond had not finished collecting its due. Chapter 2. The Rise and the Initial Struggles. Set in 1912 Washington, D.C., this chapter explores the McLeans at the height of their social power, hosting legendary parties at their estate, Friendship, where presidents and power brokers gather under Evalyn's reign. The Hope Diamond has become her constant companion and symbol of invincibility. However, cracks appear in their golden facade as Ned's drinking escalates and their marriage strains under the pressure of maintaining perfection. The birth of their son Vincent brings temporary joy and hope for dynasty continuation. Evalyn throws herself into motherhood with the same intensity she brings to collecting jewels, determined to create a perfect heir. Yet even in these moments of happiness, she feels the weight of the diamond's legend and begins experiencing small, troubling incidents that she dismisses as coincidence. The chapter builds tension through the contrast between public triumph and private anxiety, setting up the devastating tragedy to come while establishing Vincent as the light of Evalyn's life. March 15, 1912. Friday, Friendship Estate, Washington, D.C. The McLean mansion blazed against the March night like a constellation fallen to earth, every window a beacon announcing the presence of American royalty to the capital's elite. Inside, Evalyn moved through rooms thick with cigar smoke and political intrigue, the Hope Diamond catching the light of 1,000 candles as she orchestrated what the Washington Post would call the most brilliant gathering of the season. At 25, she had transformed herself into something more than a socialite. She was a force of nature, a woman who could make or break careers with a guest list. President Taft himself sat in her drawing room. His considerable bulk settled into a chair that creaked ominously under the weight of executive power. Around him, senators and Supreme Court justices mingled with foreign ambassadors and society's most glittering personalities, all drawn into Evalyn's orbit like planets around a particularly magnetic sun. She wore the Hope Diamond as she wore everything else, with absolute confidence, as if the very idea that it might bring her harm was too absurd to contemplate. "Mrs. McLean," murmured the French ambassador as she passed, "your diamond grows more magnificent each time I see it. Though I confess, the stories that follow it to Washington make for rather dramatic dinner conversation in European circles." Evalyn's laugh was like champagne bubbles rising to the surface. "Oh, ambassador, surely you don't put stock in such medieval nonsense? This is the 20th century. We've conquered the air, harnessed electricity, and built empires from nothing but determination and gold. Do you really think a piece of compressed carbon can dictate the fate of modern Americans?" Yet even as she spoke, her fingers moved unconsciously to touch the stone at her throat. It was warm against her skin, always warm, as if it stored heat from some internal fire. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between the parties and the performances, she caught herself staring into its depths, searching for something she couldn't name. The evening's triumph was marred only by Ned's increasingly erratic behavior. She found him in the library, swaying slightly, as he poured himself another scotch from the crystal decanter that seemed to empty itself with alarming frequency these days. His handsome face was flushed, his eyes bright with the particular intensity that alcohol brought to weak men trying to appear strong. "Magnificent party, darling," he said, his words only slightly slurred. "Though I noticed Senator Lodge spent considerable time discussing our recent expenditures. Apparently, the purchase of cursed jewelry has become a topic of interest among the fiscal conservatives." Evalyn closed the library door behind her, shutting out the music and laughter that filled the rest of the house. "Ned, you're drinking too much. And you're talking too much. Our financial affairs are not suitable topics for public discussion, cursed or otherwise." He turned to face her, and for a moment she saw not the charming heir she had married but something smaller, more desperate. "Our affairs, Evie? Or your affairs? Because last I checked, it was your inheritance funding these spectacular displays of excess, not the McLean coffers." The accusation hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. It was true, of course. The Camp Bird mine continued to pour gold into her personal accounts, while the newspaper business, under Ned's increasingly unreliable management, showed troubling signs of strain. But acknowledging that truth would mean acknowledging that their marriage had become as much a business arrangement as a love affair. "The money is ours," she said finally, "just as the responsibilities are ours, which includes the responsibility not to embarrass ourselves or our families with public displays of intoxication." Before Ned could respond, a soft knock interrupted them. Their butler appeared, his face carefully neutral. "Madam, the doctor has arrived. He says the matter is urgent." Evalyn's heart stopped. She had been feeling unwell for weeks, a strange combination of nausea and exhaustion that she had attributed to the social season's demands. But now, seeing the physician's grave expression as he entered the library, she felt the first cold touch of genuine fear. Dr. Morrison was their family physician, a discreet man who understood that the medical affairs of prominent families required delicate handling. He bowed slightly to both McLeans before delivering news that would change everything. "Congratulations, Mrs. McLean. You are with child." The words hit her like a physical blow. Pregnant. After 3 years of marriage, she was finally going to give Ned the heir that both families expected, the child who would unite two great American fortunes and carry their legacy into the future. She sank into a chair, her hand instinctively moving to her still, flat stomach. Ned's face transformed, the petulance and alcohol-induced irritation replaced by something approaching wonder. A child? Evie, do you realize what this means? The first grandchild of both the Walsh and McLean dynasties. This child will inherit everything. The mines, the newspapers, the entire empire we've built. Over the following months, as her pregnancy progressed, Evalyn threw herself into preparing for motherhood with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She hired the finest nurses, consulted with the most prominent pediatricians, and began planning a nursery that would rival anything in European palaces. The Hope Diamond remained her constant companion, even as her body changed and her social calendar necessarily contracted. The birth, when it came in November 1912, was both triumphant and terrifying. Vincent Walsh McLean entered the world with a cry that seemed to announce his arrival to the entire capital. Evalyn, exhausted but exhilarated, held her son and felt something she had never experienced before. A love so fierce and protective it frightened her with its intensity. "He's perfect," she whispered to Ned, who stood beside the bed looking stunned by the reality of fatherhood. "Look at him, darling. He's going to be extraordinary." And he was. Vincent grew into a beautiful, intelligent child who seemed to embody all the promise of his combined heritage. The press dubbed him the $100 million baby, and Evalyn reveled in the attention while simultaneously becoming obsessively protective of her son's safety. She hired bodyguards, installed the latest security systems, and rarely let him out of her sight. But even as she built walls of money and vigilance around her precious child, strange incidents began to multiply. Servants fell ill with mysterious ailments. Horses in their stable died suddenly and without explanation. A chandelier in the ballroom crashed to the floor moments after a party ended, shattering into 1,000 pieces that glittered like malevolent stars. Each incident was easily explained away. Coincidence, bad luck, the ordinary hazards of life. But they accumulated like storm clouds on the horizon, and Evalyn found herself touching the Hope Diamond more frequently, as if seeking reassurance from the very object that others claimed was the source of their troubles. One evening, as she sat in the nursery watching Vincent sleep, she noticed how the diamond seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, almost like a second heartbeat. The thought crossed her mind that perhaps the stone was not content to simply rest against her throat. Perhaps it was listening, waiting, choosing its moment to collect the price that all its previous owners had ultimately paid. But she pushed the thought away. She was Evalyn Walsh McLean, and she had never believed in surrendering to fear. The diamond was hers, just as everything else in her glittering world was hers, and she would keep it all: the wealth, the power, the perfect child, the legendary jewel, because she had never learned that some things in this world could not be bought, controlled, or possessed without consequence. The curse, if it existed, was patient. It could wait. Chapter 3. The Major Setback or Crisis. The chapter opens on the devastating day in 1919 when 9-year-old Vincent is killed in a car accident outside the McLean estate. The tragedy shatters Evalyn's world completely, transforming her from a confident socialite into a grief-stricken mother consumed by guilt and rage. She becomes convinced that the Hope Diamond's curse is real, and that her arrogance in dismissing it has cost her son's life. Ned responds to the loss by retreating deeper into alcoholism, and their marriage begins its final disintegration as they blame each other and themselves. Evalyn turns desperately to spiritualism, spending fortunes on mediums and seances in futile attempts to contact Vincent's spirit. The chapter explores the depths of parental grief and the way tragedy can strip away all pretense, leaving only raw human pain. The Hope Diamond, once a symbol of power, now feels like a weight around her neck, a constant reminder of her fatal hubris. May 18, 1919, Sunday, Friendship Estate, Washington, D.C. The scream that tore from Evalyn's throat when they brought her the news was not entirely human. It was the sound of something fundamental breaking, of a soul being ripped apart by forces too terrible to comprehend. Her beautiful boy, her golden child, her reason for living, dead at 9 years old, struck down by a Ford automobile as he chased his beloved terrier across the street near their estate gates. She had been in the garden, overseeing preparations for another of her legendary Sunday gatherings, when the butler approached with that peculiar walk that servants develop when bearing news too awful to deliver. The afternoon had been perfect, May sunshine filtering through the cherry blossoms, the air sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine, the kind of day that makes one believe in the fundamental goodness of the universe. Now all of that beauty felt like a mockery. "Madam," the butler had said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there has been an accident, Master Vincent." The words that followed became a roar in her ears, drowning out everything except the terrible final truth. Vincent, the heir to 2 great fortunes, the child she had protected with armies of nurses and bodyguards and gates, had been killed by something as mundane as a motor car. All her wealth, all her precautions, all her certainty that money could shield her family from tragedy, none of it had mattered. She ran to where they had brought him, her silk dress tearing on rose thorns as she pushed through the garden. He lay on a stretcher in the entrance hall, his small body broken but his face peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep. Evalyn collapsed beside him, gathering him into her arms, rocking back and forth as she whispered his name over and over, as if she could call him back from wherever he had gone. The Hope diamond, which she had worn that morning as she wore it every morning, felt suddenly heavy against her throat, not just heavy, but burning, as if the stone itself was on fire. For the first time since she had purchased it 8 years earlier, she wanted to tear it from her neck and hurl it into the darkness, to rid herself of this cursed thing that had brought death into her home. The funeral was a spectacle of grief that Washington would remember for decades. Every important figure in American society attended, from President Wilson to Supreme Court justices to foreign ambassadors. The flowers alone cost more than most people earned in a year, but Evalyn remembered none of it. She moved through the ceremony like a ghost in her own life, her face a mask of anguish, her eyes vacant and unfocused. Ned's response to their son's death was to disappear into a bottle and never fully emerge. Where Evalyn's grief turned inward, consuming her from within like acid, his exploded outward in rage and self-destruction. He began drinking from morning until night, his behavior becoming increasingly violent and unpredictable. He would rage at servants, smash furniture, accuse Evalyn of being a terrible mother who had killed their son with her obsession with cursed jewels. "You brought this into our house." He screamed at her one night, pointing at the Hope diamond with a shaking finger. "Everyone warned you about that damned stone, but you had to have it. You had to prove you were stronger than kings and queens and sultans. Well, congratulations, Evie. You've proven that even American money can't protect against an ancient curse." The accusation hit her like a physical blow because part of her believed it was true. She had dismissed the warnings, laughed at the superstitions, convinced herself that her wealth and position made her immune to the fate that had befallen previous owners. Now her son was dead, and the diamond sat in its case like a malevolent eye, watching her suffer. In her desperation, Evalyn turned to spiritualism. The movement was at its height in post-war America, with thousands of grieving mothers seeking contact with sons lost to battle or tragedy. She became obsessed with the idea that death was not the end, that somehow she could still reach Vincent across the veil of mortality. She spent fortunes on mediums, hosting seances in rooms draped with black velvet, desperately seeking any sign that her son's spirit still existed somewhere. The mediums, sensing her desperation and her wealth, told her what she wanted to hear. They claimed to channel Vincent's voice, delivering messages that Evalyn clung to with pathetic hope. He was happy, they said. He was in a better place. He wanted her to stop grieving, to live her life, to know that he loved her still. But even as she wanted to believe, some part of her knew it was all performance, cruel exploitation of a mother's broken heart. Her remaining children, Edward Jr., whom they called Nettie, and baby Evalyn, became almost invisible to her in her grief. She could barely stand to look at them, each one a reminder of the child she had lost, each one a potential target for whatever malevolent force had taken Vincent. The guilt was overwhelming. She had other children. She should be grateful for them, should focus on keeping them safe. But all she could think about was Vincent's laugh, his smile, the way he had looked at her with such trust and love. The parties at Friendship stopped. The house that had once blazed with light and laughter became a mausoleum where two broken people wandered separate paths through rooms haunted by memory. Evalyn would stand for hours in Vincent's nursery, now preserved exactly as he had left it, holding the Hope Diamond up to the light and asking it why, begging it to take her instead, to end her suffering. Friends who had once competed for her attention began to drift away, unable to cope with the person she had become. The vibrant, confident woman who had taken Washington by storm had been replaced by someone hollow, haunted, aged beyond her years by grief. She started wearing the Hope Diamond constantly, even to bed, as if it had become not just a piece of jewelry, but a shackle that bound her to her fate. The question that tormented her above all others was whether the curse was real. Had she, through her arrogance and disbelief, brought this tragedy upon her family? Or was it simply random chance, the kind of meaningless accident that could happen to anyone, regardless of their wealth or the jewels they wore? She could not decide which possibility was worse, that her son had died because of a supernatural curse she had dismissed, or that he had died for no reason at all, that the universe was simply cruel and indifferent to human suffering. Either way, she was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The Hope Diamond remained at her throat, beautiful and terrible, a constant reminder of the price of hubris. She had believed herself invincible, protected by wealth and status from the ordinary sorrows that afflicted common people. Now she knew better. Money could not protect against grief. Status could not shield against loss. And some prices, once paid, could never be refunded, no matter how much gold you pulled from the earth. As 1919 drew to a close, Evalyn Walsh McLean sat alone in her mansion, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth and power, wearing the most famous diamond in the world around her neck like a noose. She had everything that money could buy, and had lost the only thing that truly mattered. The curse, whether real or imagined, had claimed its first victim from her family, but it was not finished with her yet. Chapter 4: The Unraveling. The 1920s bring no relief to Evalyn's suffering as tragedy continues to stalk her family. Her husband Ned's mental state deteriorates completely due to alcoholism and grief, leading to his institutionalization in 1921 and their eventual separation. The Washington Post struggles under mismanagement, forcing its eventual sale. Evalyn becomes increasingly erratic, throwing herself into charity work and social causes while battling her own addiction to morphine. The chapter focuses on her relationship with her daughter, Evalyn Jr., who grows up damaged by her mother's neglect and the family's curse. In 1946, Evalyn Jr. dies of a drug overdose at age 25, dealing Evalyn another devastating blow. The psychological toll of losing two children while the Hope Diamond remains her constant, malevolent companion drives her deeper into isolation and despair. This chapter explores how prolonged grief and guilt can destroy even the strongest person, leaving Evalyn trapped in a prison of her own making. November 3, 1925, Tuesday, Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Hospital, Baltimore. The man strapped to the bed bore little resemblance to the charming heir who had once swept Evalyn off her feet at a Washington garden party. Ned McLean's face was gaunt, his eyes wild with the particular madness that comes from years of trying to drown grief in alcohol. When he saw her enter the sanitarium room, he began to laugh, a high, broken sound that made the nurses exchange worried glances. "Evie," he cried, struggling against the leather restraints. "My darling wife. Have you brought your blue friend to visit? I've been telling the doctors about our house guest. They find the story quite fascinating." Evalyn stood frozen in the doorway, the Hope diamond heavy at her throat. 6 years had passed since Vincent's death, and Ned had spent every one of them systematically destroying himself. The drinking had progressed beyond mere alcoholism into something darker, a complete break with reality that no amount of money or medical intervention could repair. "Hello, Ned," she said softly, stepping into the room. The smell of disinfectant and human despair made her stomach clench. "How are you feeling today?" "Feeling?" He tilted his head like a curious bird. "I feel magnificent. I feel cursed. I feel like a man whose wife invited the devil to dinner and forgot to mention it was a potluck." His laughter dissolved into sobs. "Our boy, Evie. Our beautiful boy. The stone took him, didn't it? It's hungry, and we fed it our child." The accusation hit her like a physical blow, not because it was cruel, but because part of her believed it was true. She had signed the commitment papers 3 months earlier, after Ned had tried to sell the Washington Post to pay gambling debts he couldn't remember incurring. The newspaper that had been the McLean family's crown jewel for generations was gone, sold to Eugene Meyer for a fraction of its worth, because she could no longer trust her husband's judgment. "The doctors say you're making progress," she lied, settling into the visitor's chair. "They think with time and proper care." "Time?" Ned's voice dropped to a whisper. "Time is what we don't have, darling. The curse doesn't wait. It just keeps taking and taking until there's nothing left but empty rooms and expensive regrets." After leaving the hospital, Evalyn drove back to Friendship in silence, her chauffeur navigating the autumn roads while she stared out at the changing leaves and wondered how her life had become such a catalogue of loss. The estate felt different now, not just empty, but hollow, as if the house itself was grieving. Most of the staff had been dismissed as her fortune dwindled, and the remaining servants moved through the halls like ghosts. Her daughter, Evalyn Jr., now 21 and beautiful in the fragile way of damaged things, was waiting in the drawing room with a martini in her hand and desperation in her eyes. The girl had grown up in the shadow of her dead brother and absent father, raised by nannies while her mother battled demons both real and imagined. "How is Daddy?" Evalyn Jr. asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "The same," Evalyn replied, pouring herself a drink from the crystal decanter that seemed to be the only constant in their disintegrating world. "Perhaps worse." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 women bound by blood and tragedy, each lost in her own private hell. Evalyn Jr. had inherited the Walsh beauty and the McLean instability, a dangerous combination that manifested in reckless behavior and an increasingly serious dependency on sleeping pills. "Mother," the younger woman said finally, "I've been thinking about the diamond. About the stories. Do you ever wonder if we should—" "No." Evalyn's voice was sharp. "I will not give it up. It's the only thing that stayed with me through everything. Husbands leave, children die, friends abandon you, but the diamond remains. To sell it would be to admit that the curse has won. But what if keeping it means losing everything else?" Evalyn touched the stone at her throat, feeling its familiar warmth. Then, perhaps that's the price of having something truly extraordinary. Not everyone is meant to own a legend. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of morphine and regret. Evalyn had begun taking the drug for chronic headaches, but it quickly became her escape from a reality too painful to bear sober. She threw elaborate parties for wounded veterans, funded charities for orphaned children, and appeared at social functions with the Hope Diamond blazing at her throat. But she was performing the role of Evalyn McLean rather than living it. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. She would give away expensive jewelry on whims, then spend days trying to buy it back. She made and lost fortunes in wild investments, her judgment clouded by grief and drugs. Friends from her golden years gradually fell away, unable to cope with what she had become, leaving her surrounded by sycophants and opportunists drawn to her wealth like moths to a dying flame. The final blow came on a gray February morning in 1946. Evalyn Jr. was found dead in her Georgetown apartment, an empty bottle of sleeping pills on her nightstand, and a note that simply read, "I'm sorry, Mother, I couldn't carry it anymore." When they brought her the news, Evalyn didn't scream this time. She didn't rage or bargain with God, or search for someone to blame. She simply sat in her chair, staring at the Hope Diamond as it caught the weak winter light, and felt something inside her die. Her daughter, her beautiful troubled daughter, had chosen death over life in the shadow of the family curse. The funeral was smaller than Vincent's had been, attended mostly by curiosity seekers and reporters eager to document the latest chapter in the Hope Diamond's bloody legacy. Evalyn stood at the graveside wearing black silk and blue fire, looking like a queen of the underworld presiding over her own kingdom of the dead. That night, alone in the vast emptiness of friendship, she sat in her bedroom holding the diamond up to the lamplight. 2 children dead, her husband mad, her fortune nearly gone. The curse had taken almost everything. But not her. Not yet. She was still here, still breathing, still wearing the stone that had destroyed everyone she loved. Why? She whispered to the blue depths. Why them, and not me? What are you waiting for? The diamond offered no answer, just its eternal, beautiful silence. It had outlived kings and queens, sultans and socialites. It would outlive her too, she realized. The curse wasn't that it killed its owners. The curse was that it let them live long enough to watch everything they loved disappear first. Evalyn Walsh McLean, once the toast of Washington society, now sat alone with her memories and her morphine and her magnificent, terrible jewel, waiting for the final price to be extracted from her account of suffering. The Hope Diamond pulsed against her throat like a second heart, patient and eternal, counting down the days until it would be free to find its next victim. Chapter 5. Resolution and Final Reflection. The final chapter chronicles Evalyn's last decade, from 1947 to her death in 1957. Now virtually alone, with only her son Ned Jr. surviving, she becomes a recluse in her crumbling mansion, the Hope Diamond, her sole constant companion. Her fortune exhausted by decades of tragedy and poor decisions, she faces financial ruin, but refuses to sell the stone that has defined her life. When she dies of pneumonia at age 70, she is found clutching the diamond, her final act of defiance against a curse that has taken everything else. The narrative follows the diamond's journey after her death, purchased by Harry Winston and eventually donated to the Smithsonian Institution in 1958, where it remains today. The chapter reflects on whether the curse was real or simply the inevitable consequence of believing oneself above the ordinary rules of human existence. Evalyn's legacy becomes a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of unlimited wealth and the price of hubris. April 26, 1957, Friday, Friendship Estate, Washington, D.C. Death came for Evalyn Walsh McLean on a spring morning when the cherry blossoms were in full bloom, their pink petals drifting past her bedroom window like confetti for a party she would never attend. She lay in the massive 4-poster bed where she had given birth to her children and mourned their deaths, the Hope Diamond clutched in her arthritic fingers like a rosary made of blue fire and ancient sins. At 70, she looked like a relic from another age, her once golden hair now white as bone, her face carved into sharp angles by decades of grief and morphine. The woman who had once commanded the attention of presidents and kings had been reduced to a whisper of herself, but her grip on the diamond remained strong. Even in death, she would not let it go. The nurse who found her that morning would later tell reporters that Mrs. McLean's final words had been directed not to God or to her surviving family, but to the stone itself. "You haven't won," she had whispered. "You'll never be free of me." Whether this was true or merely the invention of a woman seeking her moment in the spotlight of tragedy, no one could say. But it seemed fitting that Evalyn's last act would be one of defiance. The reading of her will reveal the full extent of the McLean family's fall from grace. The woman who had once been worth over $100 million died virtually penniless. Her fortune consumed by bad investments, charitable giving, medical bills, and the simple cost of maintaining a lifestyle that had become a performance without an audience. Friendship was mortgaged to the hilt, its grand rooms echoing with emptiness rather than laughter. But the Hope Diamond remained, and with it came the question that had haunted Evalyn for 46 years. What to do with a cursed stone that had outlived everyone who dared to own it? The answer came in the form of Harry Winston, the legendary jeweler who understood that some objects transcend mere commerce to become mythology. He purchased the entire McLean jewelry collection from her estate, but it was the Hope Diamond that truly interested him, not as a merchant seeking profit, but as a custodian of history, recognizing that some things were too dangerous to remain in private hands. For 9 years, Winston toured the stone around the world, displaying it in exhibitions where millions of people could gaze upon its beauty while remaining safely separated by glass and guards. He called it the King of Gems, but everyone knew its real title. The stone that had destroyed the McLean dynasty, the blue curse that had claimed more victims than any weapon of war. November 10th, 1958, Monday, New York City. The final journey of the Hope Diamond was both anticlimactic and perfect in its simplicity. Harry Winston, the man who had handled gems worth more than most nations' treasuries, wrapped the legendary stone in brown paper like a birthday present and walked to the nearest post office. There, for the princely sum of $2.44 in postage and $142.85 in insurance, he mailed the most notorious gem in human history to the Smithsonian Institution via registered mail. The postal worker who processed the package had no idea she was handling an object that had supposedly brought down kings and driven socialites to madness. To her, it was just another insured parcel in a day full of routine transactions. Perhaps that was the most fitting end to the Hope Diamond's career as a private possession, not with armed guards and elaborate ceremonies, but with the mundane efficiency of the United States Postal Service. The diamond arrived safely at the Smithsonian, where it was installed in a specially designed case in the Hall of Gems. Dr. George Switzer, the museum's curator of mineralogy, examined the stone with scientific detachment, noting its exceptional clarity, its unusual phosphorescence, and its fascinating history. But he found no evidence of supernatural malevolence, no trace of the curse that had supposedly claimed so many lives. "It's simply a remarkable example of natural beauty," he told reporters at the diamond's unveiling. "Any tragedies associated with its ownership are coincidental, the result of human folly rather than supernatural intervention." But the crowds that pressed against the display case seemed less convinced. They stared into the diamond's blue depths, searching for signs of evil, whispering about the McLean family's fate, and wondering if the curse had finally been broken by the stone's imprisonment behind bulletproof glass. Children dared each other to touch the case, as if the curse might leap through the barrier like electricity. Today, more than 60 years later, the Hope Diamond remains the Smithsonian's most popular attraction, viewed by millions of visitors each year who come to see the gem that destroyed one of America's most prominent families. The placard beside its case tells the story of its geological formation, its discovery in India, its journey through the hands of kings and collectors. But it says little about Evalyn Walsh McLean, the woman who wore it longest and paid the highest price for the privilege. Perhaps that silence is appropriate. Evalyn's story was never really about a diamond, cursed or otherwise. It was about the fundamental human truth that wealth cannot protect against suffering, that privilege does not exempt one from loss, that some things, love, family, peace of mind, cannot be purchased at any price. She had been born into unimaginable wealth, married into even greater fortune, and spent her life believing that money could solve any problem, overcome any obstacle, defeat any enemy. The Hope Diamond became the symbol of that belief, a legendary object that only the very wealthy could afford to own, a trophy that proclaimed her superiority to ordinary mortals who lived ordinary lives bounded by ordinary limitations. But death, as it turned out, was the most democratic force of all. It came for rich and poor alike, for the powerful and the powerless, for those who wore cursed diamonds, and those who had never seen a gem more precious than a wedding ring. Evalyn's wealth had not saved Vincent from a car accident, or protected Evalyn Jr. from despair, or prevented Ned from descending into madness. All it had done was make their tragedies more visible, more public, more symbolic of the emptiness that can exist at the heart of even the most gilded life. The real curse of the Hope Diamond was not supernatural, but psychological. It attracted people who believed themselves above the ordinary rules of human existence. People whose wealth and power had convinced them that they were special, chosen, immune to the random cruelties that shaped everyone. Elsa's fate. The stone became a magnet for hubris, and hubris, as the ancient Greeks knew, always demanded payment. In the end, Evalyn Walsh McLean's legacy is not the parties she threw, or the jewels she collected, or the headlines she generated. It is the reminder that some prices are too high to pay, that some things should not be owned, that the pursuit of the extraordinary can exact a terrible toll on the human soul. She reached for immortality and found only isolation, sought to possess a legend, and discovered that legends possess their owners in return. The Hope Diamond sits in its case at the Smithsonian, still beautiful, still mysterious, still drawing crowds who want to glimpse the gem that killed everyone who owned it. But perhaps the real lesson of its story is simpler and more human. Be careful what you wish for, because you might get it, and the cost might be everything you hold dear. Evalyn Walsh McLean wished to be unforgettable, and in that, at least, she succeeded. But immortality, as she learned too late, is not always a blessing. Sometimes it is simply another name for a curse that outlasts the grave.